The fluorescent lights in Dr. Harrison's office buzzed with an intensity that made Joseph Maxwell's head throb. He stared at the MRI scans mounted on the light board, black and white images that somehow managed to capture the end of everything he'd built. 3 months, Joseph's voice came out steadier than he expected. That's your professional opinion? Dr. Harrison leaned forward in his chair, his weathered hands clasped on the mahogany desk. What? With aggressive treatment? We might extend it to… No. Joseph straightened his Italian silk tie. Just give me the numbers. Clean. 90 days, perhaps less. The corner of Joseph's mouth twitched. 30 years building Maxwell Pharmaceutical, and death had the audacity to give him a quarterly notice. Your options for treatment. Thank you, doctor. Joseph stood, smoothing his tailored suit. I'll have my office contact yours for the paperwork. That night, sleep evaded him. Joseph paced his penthouse, Manhattan's lights twinkling below like fallen stars. Photos from board meetings and charity galas lined the walls, snapshots of a life measured in acquisitions and profit margins. "Goddamn waste," he muttered, pouring his third scotch. The amber liquid caught the light, and for a moment, he saw his reflection fractured in the crystal. 62 years old, and what did he have to show for it? A fortune he couldn't take with him, and an empty house to echo his last breaths. The phone rang, probably Marcus from the board, hounding him about the new cancer drug trials. Joseph let it ring. His hand trembled as he set down the glass, a sudden thought taking root. He walked to his closet, past the rows of tailored suits, to a box he hadn't opened in years. Inside lay old jeans, worn boots, flannel shirts, remnants from his father's construction days that he'd never been able to throw away. "You always said I'd end up in the gutter," Joseph whispered to his father's memory. "Let's see if you were right." The transformation took less than an hour. He rubbed dirt on his face, messed his silver hair, and donned the old clothes. The man in the mirror was unrecognizable, perfect. As dawn broke, Joseph slipped out through the service entrance. The morning air bit through his thin jacket as he limped down Fifth Avenue, practicing the shuffle he'd observed from the city's invisible people. Near his company's research facility, he caught fragments of conversation between two lab techs taking a smoke break. "Kids from St. Mary's Home, off the books trials. Marcus says it's handled." Joseph's blood ran cold. He pressed himself against the wall, straining to hear more. "What about the side effects? Keep your voice down. Just process the data like he said." A door slammed, leaving Joseph alone with a truth he wasn't supposed to hear. His company, his legacy, testing drugs on orphans. The scotch threatened to make a reappearance. He reached for his phone to call security, then stopped. Joseph Maxwell, CEO, was dying. But this shabby stranger, he could go anywhere, see anything. The sun climbed higher as Joseph merged into the stream of morning commuters, another shadow in the city's margin. His pulse quickened with each step away from his old life. 3 months to live. 3 months to find someone worthy of his fortune. 3 months to discover just how deep the corruption in his company ran. A siren wailed in the distance, and Joseph pulled his collar higher. He had work to do. The cardboard box Joseph called his bed offered little protection from the November chill. After a week on the streets, his designer stubble had grown into a patchy beard, and the dirt under his fingernails was no longer pretense. St. Mary's Home for Children loomed before him, its brick facade weathered by decades of city grime. He'd chosen this spot carefully, watching the comings and goings of unmarked vans, noting the faces that matched his employee database. A small figure huddled on the steps caught his attention. A girl, no more than 8, wrapped in a too-thin jacket. "Mister?" Her voice cracked. "Do you have any food?" Joseph reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against the protein bar he'd stashed there. "Oh, what's your name?" "Sarah," she coughed, a wet, rattling sound that made his chest tighten. "Here." He handed her the bar. "Why aren't you inside?" Sarah tore into the wrapper. "Nurse says I need to wait for my medicine to settle. Makes me feel funny though." "Funny how?" "Like my insides are burning." She took a small bite. "The other kids feel it too, but Miss Regina says that means it's working." Joseph's hands clenched. "Huh? Do you know what medicine they're giving you?" Sarah shook her head. "Has numbers on it. MX7. "Sarah!" A sharp voice cut through the air. A woman in scrubs stood in the doorway, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Time for your checkup." The girl scrambled up, dropping the wrapper. Joseph caught it, tucking it into his pocket as Sarah disappeared inside. That night, he waited. The security guard's rounds were predictable. 15 minutes by the east entrance, a cigarette break at 11:45, then the west wing sweep. At midnight, Joseph slipped through the basement window. His shoes, once worth more than the guard's monthly salary, silent on the linoleum floor. The filing room lock was pathetically easy to pick, a skill from his less respectable college days. Inside, manila folders lined the walls, each bearing the Maxwell Pharmaceuticals logo. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, pulling out a file. Clinical trial data, but with protocols he'd never approved. Dosages far beyond safety limits. Signature blocks missing ethical review stamps. A noise in the hallway. Joseph shoved the papers into his jacket, easing the drawer closed. "Someone's been asking questions." A man's voice, familiar. Marcus Chen, his head of research. "The street rat?" Another voice. "Dr. Wells from the board. Watching the entrance like a hawk? Think he's connected? Handle it? Quietly? We're too close to phase 3. Joseph pressed against the wall, heart thundering. The voices faded, but their meaning lingered. His own company, his life's work, had become a monster while he wasn't looking. He waited 10 minutes before moving. The guard was back at his post, absorbed in his phone. Joseph slipped out, the stolen documents burning against his chest. In the safety of an alley 3 blocks away, he examined his findings under streetlight. Trial sheets, consent forms with forged signatures, mortality rates carefully obscured in statistical noise. A sound behind him. Footsteps. "Hey, old-timer?" 3 men blocked the alley's entrance. "Heard you've been asking about St. Mary's." Joseph backed away, calculating odds. "Just looking for a warm spot to sleep." "Wrong answer." The leader cracked his knuckles. "Boss says you need to disappear." Joseph ran, papers scattering like dead leaves. He knew these streets now, knew the shortcuts and hiding places of his adopted world, but he was still a 62-year-old man with terminal cancer, and they were gaining. His lungs burned as he turned another corner. 3 months to live, and he might not make it through the night. But now he knew what his legacy had become, and if he survived, someone would pay. Rain began to fall, turning the sidewalk slick. Joseph could hear them behind him, getting closer. He clutched the remaining documents and ran faster, each step carrying him deeper into the maze of back alleys where his pursuers waited. Joseph's lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. The alley stretched before him, a narrow canyon between brick walls slick with rain. Behind him, footsteps echoed off wet stone. "End of the line, old man." He turned to face them, 3 shadows against the orange glow of distant streetlights. The leader, a man with a dragon tattoo crawling up his neck, stepped forward. "Look." Joseph raised his hands. "Whatever Marcus is paying you." Dragon Tattoo's fist connected with his jaw. The impact sent him stumbling backward into a row of metal trash cans. "Marcus!" The man laughed. "Getting sloppy there, friend." Nobody mentioned that name. Blood trickled from Joseph's split lip. He'd made a mistake, given away too much. The second man, shorter but broader, cracked his knuckle. "Guess we better make sure he can't mention any names to anyone else." The first kick caught Joseph in the ribs. He curled inward, protecting his core like he'd learned in boxing classes 30 years ago. The second kick drove the air from his lungs. Rain pelted his face as they worked him over. Professional, methodical. These weren't street thugs. They were cleaners, sent to remove a problem. Through the haze of pain, Joseph heard Dragon Tattoo speak into a phone. "Yeah, taking care of it now. No witnesses. No witnesses." The words echoed in Joseph's mind as another boot found his kidney. He was going to die here, in filth and darkness, killed by his own company's enforcers. "Hey!" A young voice pierced the night. "Leave him alone." The beating stopped. Joseph blinked through the rain and blood, trying to focus on the small figure at the alley's entrance. "Get lost, kid," Dragon Tattoo growled. "Or, this ain't your business. I called the cops." The boy held up a phone, its screen glowing in the darkness. "They're coming right now." Sirens wailed in the distance, probably unrelated, but the sound made the men hesitate. "Shit." The shorter one grabbed Dragon Tattoo's arm. "We can't risk it. Boss said clean." Dragon Tattoo delivered one final kick to Joseph's stomach. "Lucky night, old-timer. Don't let me see you again." Joseph lay there, counting breaths until their footsteps faded. Small hands grabbed his shoulder. "Can you walk? We need to move before they come back." Joseph tried to focus on the boy's face, but his vision swam. Young, maybe 12, dark hair plastered to his forehead by rain, and something else, something in the set of his jaw that tugged at Joseph's memory. Why? Joseph coughed, tasting copper. Why help me? The boy helped him sit up, surprisingly strong for his size. Because, I don't know, you remind me of someone. Joseph leaned against the wall, every movement sending fresh waves of pain through his body. What's your name, kid? Those eyes again, so familiar it hurt worse than his ribs. Aiden, come on. My house isn't far. Mom can help. No hospitals, Joseph muttered. Can't risk it? No hospitals, Aiden agreed. Just Mom. She's good with fixing things. Joseph stumbled to his feet, leaning heavily on the boy. Each step was agony, but Aiden guided him with the patience of someone used to caring for others. Almost there, Aiden said after what felt like miles. Just around this corner. They stopped at a modest brownstone. Light spilled from a ground floor window, warm and inviting. Mom! Aiden called out. I need help. The door opened, spilling more light into the street. A woman's silhouette appeared. Aiden, what? She stopped mid-sentence. Joseph looked up, and 13 years of carefully constructed walls crumbled. He knew those eyes, the same ones he'd been seeing in Aiden's face, the same ones that had haunted his dreams for more than a decade. Lillian, he whispered. Then the world tilted sideways, and darkness claimed him before he hit the ground. The first thing Joseph noticed was the smell, lavender and antiseptic, a combination that pulled him back to another time, another life. His eyes fluttered open to find himself on a worn couch, his ribs wrapped tight. Don't try to move, Lillian's voice, unchanged after 13 years. Oi, you might have internal bleeding. He turned his head, found her sitting in a threadbare armchair. She looked older, harder, the softness he remembered replaced by something weathered and sharp. How long? His voice was sandpaper. About 2 hours. She pressed a glass of water to his lips. Aiden's asleep. He doesn't know who you are. The water helped, but the pain in his chest had nothing to do with his injury. He called me Dad in the alley. He was probably just, don't. Joseph tried to sit up. Failed. He has your eyes. My father's jaw. Lillian set the glass down hard enough to slosh water onto the coffee table. You lost the right to discuss his features when you walked out 13 years ago. You told me you couldn't. He coughed, tasting copper again. Essie, the doctor said you were infertile. I thought I was. Her laugh was bitter coffee. No sugar. Surprise. Memory hit him like another kick to the ribs. That last fight in their apartment. The fertility specialist's report crumpled in his fist. Her tears, his cowardice. Why didn't you tell me? I tried. She stood, pacing the small living room. Called your office for weeks. Your secretary said you were unavailable. Then I heard you'd moved to the London office. Marcus, Joseph closed his eyes. Marcus said he'd handle all my personal calls. Well, he handled them, all right. Lillian stopped at a small bookshelf, picked up a framed photo. By the time I knew about the twins, twins? The word hit like a defibrillator to his chest. The photo slipped from her fingers, glass shattering on hardwood. Lillian's face went pale. I shouldn't have. She bent to pick up the pieces. Forget I said anything. Joseph's heart stuttered, skipped. The room spun as he forced himself upright. Lillian, what twins? Dad? Aiden stood in the doorway, sleep rumpled and confused. Mom, why are you crying? The pain in Joseph's chest exploded. Not his ribs, something deeper, fundamental. The room tilted again, colors bleeding together. Joseph! Lillian's voice seemed far away. Oh God, he's having a heart attack. Aiden, call 911. He tried to speak, to reach for the son he'd never known, but darkness was creeping in from the edges. The last thing he saw was Aiden's face, Lillian's eyes, bending over him with concern. Then nothing. Beeping machines, antiseptic smell again, but industrial strength this time. Hospital. He was alive. BP's stabilizing. Unknown voice. Get Dr. Chen in here. Chen? Marcus Chen? No. Joseph forced his eyes open. No. Chen. Sir, please don't try to. Different doctor. Lillian's voice cut in. Family request. Family. The word echoed in his mind as consciousness slipped away again. He had a family, a son, twins. And if Marcus had kept this from him, what else had his trusted friend buried? The next time he woke, sunlight was streaming through Venetian blinds. Lillian sat beside his bed, reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed what looked like lab reports. Maxwell Pharmaceuticals letterhead, he croaked. She looked up, startled, quickly folded the papers away. How much do you remember? Enough. He reached for her hand, found empty air as she pulled back. Lillian, there's something happening at the company. Something bad. I know. She stood, gathering her things. But right now you need to rest. We'll talk when you're stronger. Wait. He caught her wrist. The twins, please. She hesitated at the door, one hand on the frame. Rest, Joseph. You'll need your strength for what's coming. He watched her go, thoughts spinning like autumn leaves in a storm. Somewhere in the city, Marcus Chen was destroying everything he'd built. Somewhere, another child carried his blood. And here he lay, a dying man with 3 months to live, discovering he'd had a family all along. A week after his heart attack, Joseph stood at the window of his hospital room, watching Aiden play basketball in the courtyard below. The boy had his father's competitive streak, refusing to quit until he made the shot, no matter how many attempts it took. He's failing chemistry, Lillian's voice came from the doorway. But he's got a perfect score in math, just like his old man. Joseph didn't turn around. Are you going to tell me about your job? The rustle of papers behind him. I processed trial data for Maxwell Pharmaceutical, level 3 clearance. Now he did turn. How long? 5 years. She sat in the visitor's chair, pulled out a thick manila folder, long enough to notice patterns, irregularities. The orphanage trials. Her eyes snapped up. How did you? I've been investigating. He moved to sit on the bed's edge. That's why those men attacked me. Lillian's hands tightened on the folder. Then you know about Project MX742? Some? Not enough. He studied her face. What aren't you telling me? Before she could answer, commotion erupted in the courtyard. Joseph turned back to the window. Aiden was on his knees, clutching his stomach. No, Lillian whispered. She was already moving, the folder forgotten on her chair. Joseph grabbed it, then followed as fast as his weakened heart would allow. By the time he reached the courtyard, a small crowd had gathered. Aiden lay curled on his side, face contorted in pain. It burns, the boy gasped. Mom, it burns like before. Lillian went white. Call Dr. Rivera. Now. Before. Joseph knelt beside them. This has happened before. But Lillian was focused on Aiden, her hands checking his pulse, his temperature. Medical staff arrived with a gurney, efficiently transferring him despite his whimpers of pain. In the emergency room, Joseph opened the folder while they waited. Clinical trial data for MX742, an experimental gene therapy. His eyes caught on familiar names: St. Mary's Home, dates, dosage levels. Then something else. A list of test subject. Aiden Maxwell Collins. Status: exposed in utero. Jesus Christ. The papers shook in his hands. Lillian, did you know? Know what? She looked up from her phone, where she'd been texting frantically. He handed her the document, watched the color drain from her face. That's not possible. She flipped through pages. I didn't participate in any trials, but you worked in the building. A horrible suspicion formed. The cafeteria, the water supply. Dr. Rivera emerged from Aiden's room, her face grave. We've stabilized him, but these symptoms, they match a rare genetic condition we've been seeing in children from St. Mary's. What condition? Joseph demanded. Multi-system organ deterioration. It appears to be triggered by exposure to certain chemical compounds. She hesitated. Has Aiden been part of any medical trials? Lillian's hands crushed the papers. Not knowingly. The doctor nodded as if this confirmed something. He'll need a full genetic workup, and, she glanced at Joseph, given the familial connection, you should be tested too. Joseph's terminal diagnosis sat heavy in his chest. 3 months to live. Now his son. How long? His voice cracked. How long does he have without treatment? Hard to say. The other cases progressed differently. Some stabilized with transplants. Others what? Dr. Rivera met his eyes. Didn't make it past 6 months. Lillian made a sound like breaking glass. Joseph reached for her hand. This time, she let him take it. There's more, she whispered. About the twins. About why? The monitors in Aiden's room began screaming. Dr. Rivera rushed back in, shouting orders. Through the window, Joseph watched his son convulse on the hospital bed. And 13 years of corporate decisions crashed down on him like an avalanche. His company, his ignorance, his son. The folder lay scattered at his feet, secrets spilling across sterile hospital tiles. The hospital cafeteria sat empty at 3 a.m., its fluorescent lights casting sickly shadows. Joseph stared into his cold coffee while Lillian paced, her heels clicking against linoleum. "Explain it again," he said. "From the beginning. MEX 742 was supposed to be a breakthrough." She stopped pacing. "Gene therapy for hereditary diseases. But the early trials failed? Worse." She sat across from him. "They worked too well. Started modifying genes that weren't targeted. Created new mutations." Joseph pushed away his coffee. "And Marcus covered it up." "He didn't just cover it up." Lillian pulled out her phone, showed him an email chain. He saw potential? A drug that could rewrite DNA? The military applications alone, so he tested it on children. The words tasted like ash. "Orphans first, then," she swallowed. "Pregnant employees, small doses in the water supply, the air filtration system, all while I was carrying the twins." The cafeteria door swung open. Dr. Rivera entered, carrying a thick medical file. "The results are back," she said, sitting beside them. "It's not good." She spread charts across the table. Complex genetic sequences, mutation markers, degradation patterns. Joseph had approved enough trials to recognize catastrophic failure. Aiden's DNA is fundamentally unstable," she explained. "The changes are accelerating." "How long?" Lillian's voice was steel. "Without intervention, 2 months, maybe less." Dr. Rivera hesitated. "But there's something else. These patterns, they're identical to cases we've seen in Spain." Joseph's head snapped up. "Spain?" "A private clinic in Barcelona. They've reported 6 cases with the exact same genetic markers." Lillian went pale. No. What aren't you telling me?" Joseph demanded. Before she could answer, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Your son isn't the only one dying. Check the White Clinic, Barcelona, MW." "Mrs. White?" Lillian whispered. She took. The hospital intercom crackled. "Code blue, pediatric ICU, code blue." They ran. Joseph's heart protested each step, but adrenaline carried him forward. They found organized chaos in Aiden's room. Doctors, machines, the terrible monotone of a flatlined heart monitor. "He's crashing." Dr. Rivera pushed past them. "Get me 40 cc's of—" "No!" Lillian grabbed the doctor's arm. "His system can't handle standard protocols. The mutations—" Dr. Rivera hesitated, then nodded. What do you suggest?" Lillian rattled off a complex combination of treatments, things Joseph recognized from the experimental files. The medical team moved with precise urgency. Slowly, terribly slowly, the monitor found Aiden's rhythm again. Hours later, when the crisis had passed, Joseph found Lillian in the chapel. "You knew exactly what treatment he needed," he said quietly. "Hey, because you've seen this before." She didn't look up from her clasped hands. "In Barcelona, at the White Clinic. Tell me." "Elia." The name fell like a tear. "Our daughter, Mrs. White, helped me hide her when they threatened to take both babies for the program." Joseph sank into the pew beside her. "We have a daughter." "Had?" Lillian's voice cracked. "When? If these symptoms are appearing in Barcelona." The truth hit him like a physical blow. 2 children, both dying, both victims of his company's crimes. How do we save them? "The only known treatment is a complete bone marrow transplant. But with their genetic instability," she finally met his eyes, "we need a donor with compatible markers who hasn't been exposed to MX 742. Understanding dawned. "Me?" "Yes," she touched his arm. "Oh, but with your heart condition, the transplant would kill me." He laughed without humor. "Instead of 3 months, I'd have what? Days? If you survived the procedure at all." Joseph stood, walked to the chapel's small window. Dawn was breaking over the city. His city, where children were dying because he hadn't paid attention. "Book the flights to Barcelona," he said. "It's time to meet our daughter." First class meant nothing when every patch of turbulence sent pain through Joseph's chest. He studied Lillian's sleeping form in the seat across the aisle, wondering how she'd carried this burden alone for so long. "She looks peaceful," Aiden whispered from beside him. The boy was pale but stable enough to travel, thanks to Lillian's modified treatment protocol. "She does." Joseph turned to his son. "Oh, what did she tell you? About where we're going?" Aiden fidgeted with his blanket. "That I have a sister. That she's sick like me." He paused. "That you're really my dad. How long have you known?" "I didn't. Not really." Aiden's eyes, Lillian's eyes met his. But that night in the alley, something felt right. The plane shuddered, and Joseph pressed a hand to his chest. Aiden noticed. "Nee, Mom says you're sick too." "Yes? Are you going to die?" Joseph studied his son's face, all 13 years of missed moments carved into one honest question. "Everyone dies, Aiden. The trick is making it count." Lillian stirred across the aisle. "We're almost there." She checked her phone. "Mrs. White is expecting us." The White Clinic occupied an old villa in Barcelona's outskirts. Bougainvillea climbed whitewashed walls, beauty masking purpose. A tall woman with silver hair waited at the entrance. "Margaret?" Lillian embraced her. "How is she?" Mrs. White's face was grave. "Failing. Like the others." She turned to Joseph. "So the great Joseph Maxwell finally learns the truth." "You were my head of research," he said, "before Marcus, until I discovered what he was planning." She led them inside. By then, Lillian was already pregnant. I helped her hide Elia, gave her a job in data processing where she could monitor the program. They stopped at a window overlooking a garden. A girl sat among the flowers, dark hair falling over her face as she sketched in a notebook. "Elia," Lillian breathed. Joseph's heart stuttered. She was Aiden's mirror, same jaw, same focused expression. She looked up, as if sensing them, and his world shifted. "Why, she doesn't know you're coming," Mrs. White said. "Any of you? I'll go first," Lillian decided. She squeezed Joseph's arm. "Wait here." They watched as Lillian approached their daughter, saw the confusion, recognition, tears. Mother and daughter collapsed into each other's arms. "Did you know?" Joseph asked Mrs. White. "About the water supply?" "I suspected. Couldn't prove it." She handed him a file. But I've been developing something. A treatment that might work. If what?" "If we had clean genetic material, uncontaminated bone marrow." She met his eyes. "It would kill you. I'm already dying." "No," she smiled sadly. "You're not." Joseph's hand clenched on the file. "What?" "Your cancer diagnosis. Faked. Marcus needed you distracted, devastated, easy to manipulate." She nodded toward the garden. "He never expected you to find them." The truth hit like a tidal wave. 3 months to live had been a lie, a manipulation to keep him from looking too closely at the company's operation. In the garden, Aiden had joined his mother and sister, 3 parts of his heart, finally united. "The transplant," he said, "without terminal cancer, still dangerous, but survivable." Mrs. White touched his arm. "They need their father, Joseph. All of them." Lillian was waving them down. Joseph moved toward his family, each step carrying 13 years of missed moment. Elia looked up as he approached. "I know you," she said in perfect English, "from the photographs Mama kept." "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry I didn't know." She studied him with artist's eyes. "Will you help us?" "Yes." He knelt before his children, his miracles, his redemption. "I'll do whatever it takes." Behind them, Mrs. White spoke quietly into a phone, making arrangements, setting plans in motion. But Joseph barely heard her. He was too busy memorizing his daughter's smile, identical to her brother's, wondering how he'd survived so long without knowing this kind of love existed. The first shot came as they were leaving the garden. Glass shattered, and Mrs. White crumpled, clutching her shoulder. "Inside!" Joseph shoved his family toward the clinic doors. "Now!" More shots. Lillian grabbed the twins, pushing them beneath a stone bench. Joseph dragged Mrs. White behind a column. "Marcus," she gasped through gritted teeth. "He must have tracked your flight." "The treatment files," Joseph realized. "Where are they?" "Safe." She pressed a bloody thumb drive into his palm. "But the samples, the equipment, we need them." Tires screeched on gravel. Men in tactical gear poured from black SUVs. "Dad!" Aiden's voice cracked with fear. "Stay down!" Joseph scanned for options. The clinic's security gates were closing, but too slowly. Lillian's voice cut through the chaos. "The tunnels." "What tunnels?" "World War II evacuation routes." Mrs. White struggled to her feet. "Below the villa." "Margaret, the key card." "Here." The older woman pulled a blood-smeared card from her jacket. "Storage room B. Everything you need is there." The first intruder reached the garden. Joseph recognized Dragon Tattoo from the alley. "Get them out!" Mrs. White shoved him toward his family. "I'll hold them off." "Margaret, go!" She pulled a gun from beneath her desk, firing precise shots that sent the attackers diving for cover. Joseph ran to his family. The door, Lillian pointed to a half-hidden entrance. Quickly, they raced through sterile corridors, footsteps echoing. Behind them, gunfire and shouts grew closer. Here, Lillian swiped the keycard. Storage room B looked like a medical supply closet until she pulled a hidden lever. The floor opened, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. The samples, Joseph said. We need... Already packed. Lillian grabbed a prepared medical case. Margaret knew they'd come. Elia stumbled, pale and sweating. Her brother caught her. The stress is accelerating the degradation, Lillian warned. We need to move. Down they went into cool darkness. Their phones provided weak light. Water dripped somewhere ahead. Where does this lead? Joseph brought up the rear, listening for pursuit. The old city. Lillian guided them through turns. Margaret has a safe house. A crash echoed from above. They were in the tunnels. Run, Joseph whispered. They ran, through darkness, through history. Elia's breathing grew labored. Aiden supported her, but he too was weakening. Light ahead, another exit. But as they approached, shadows moved against it. They know the routes, Lillian realized. We're trapped. Joseph made a decision. Take them left at the next fork. I'll draw them off. No, Lillian grabbed his arm. We need you. The transplant won't matter if they catch us. He kissed her quickly. 13 years of regret in one moment. I'll find you. Papa, please, Elia whispered. He hugged his children, memorizing their faces in the dim light. I love you, all of you. Now go. They went. Joseph waited until their footsteps faded, then ran toward the exit, shouting, flashlight beams. He knocked over old crates, creating noise and chaos. There! Dragon Tattoo's voice. Get him! Joseph ran, lungs burning, away from his family, away from the safe house, through tunnels that grew narrower, older, a dead end, no, a collapse. Moonlight filtered through cracks in ancient stone. Nowhere left to run, Mr. Maxwell. Joseph turned. 3 men, guns raised. Dragon Tattoo smiled. Marcus sends his regards. Funny, a voice said from above. So do I. Mrs. White dropped from the collapsed ceiling, firing as she fell. Her aim hadn't suffered from the shoulder wound. Dragon Tattoo went down. His men scattered. The others? She asked, reloading. Safe, I hope. Joseph helped her up. Margaret, your shoulder will heal. She handed him a phone. Lillian's coordinate. The safe house has everything we need. Why help us? After all this time? She smiled through the pain. Someone had to protect them from men like Marcus. Now come on. Your children need their father. They emerged into Barcelona's night, sirens wailing in the distance. Joseph looked at the phone's map, at the blinking dot that represented his family. Time to make things right. The safe house was a converted monastery on Barcelona's outskirts, stone walls 3 feet thick, and a state-of-the-art medical facility hidden beneath medieval architecture. Your O2 stats are dropping, Dr. Rivera said, checking Aiden's vitals. They'd flown her in secretly 2 days ago. Both of you. Elia lay in the next bed, sketchpad abandoned. Even breathing seemed to exhaust her now. How long? Lillian asked. Days, maybe less. Dr. Rivera glanced at her tablet. The genetic degradation is accelerating. Joseph stood at the window, watching dawn paint the city gold. Mrs. White's treatment protocols were ready. The specialized equipment was in place. All they needed was him. What are my odds? He asked. With the heart condition? Dr. Rivera hesitated. 20% chance of survival. The procedure will put massive strain on your cardiovascular system. And without the transplant? She met his eyes. They won't last the week. A knock at the door. Mrs. White, arm in a sling. We have a problem. She turned on the television. Marcus Chen's face filled the screen, standing at a podium with the Maxwell Pharmaceuticals logo behind him. Tragic accident at our Barcelona facility, he was saying. We're cooperating fully with authorities to locate Mr. Maxwell and his family, ensure their safety. He's getting ahead of the story, Mrs. White said, painting himself as the hero. The press conference isn't the problem. Lillian pointed to the crawl at the bottom of the screen. Look, breaking news. Police raid multiple locations in Barcelona. They're closing in. Joseph turned from the window. Huey, how long to prep for surgery? Joseph, Lillian started. How long? Dr. Rivera checked her notes. 6 hours minimum, but your heart won't matter if they find us first. He sat between his children's beds. Do it today. Elia's hand found his. You could die. I should have died in that alley. He squeezed her fingers. Instead, I found you, both of you. Dad! Aiden's voice was weak. I never got to show you my jump shot. Joseph's vision blurred. You will, I promise. The next hours passed in a blur of preparation. Blood draws, medication protocols, final checks of equipment. The police have started searching this district, Mrs. White reported. We have maybe 8 hours before they find us. We'll be done by then, Dr. Rivera said. Oh, one way or another. Joseph changed into a hospital gown, trying to ignore how his hands shook. Lillian found him sitting beside the twins. I should have told you, she whispered. All those years ago. I should have stayed. He took her hand. We both made mistakes. Joseph Maxwell. A nurse appeared. We're ready. The surgical suite was small but immaculate. As they prepped him, Joseph could hear monitoring equipment from the adjacent room where his children lay. The procedure will take approximately 4 hours, Dr. Rivera explained. We'll extract bone marrow from multiple sites to increase yield. Once we have enough, an alarm blared. One of the monitors next door was screaming, "Cardiac arrhythmia," a nurse called. Both subjects. No. Joseph tried to sit up. Let me. Hold him. Dr. Rivera ordered. We need to start now. The last thing Joseph saw before the anesthesia took him was Lillian's face above his own, tears falling onto his cheeks. Fight, she whispered. Fight for us. Then darkness came, and Joseph Maxwell, who had spent his life building walls around his heart, surrendered to the thing he feared most, love. Joseph floated in darkness, voices drifting around him like autumn leaves. BP dropping, push another unit, losing them both. Sometimes he heard Lillian singing softly, an old lullaby he remembered from their first apartment. Sometimes he heard his children breathing in synchronized gasps. He fought his way toward consciousness, toward the sound of machines tracking 3 heartbeats, his own, stuttering but persistent, and his children, growing stronger. Mr. Maxwell? Dr. Rivera's voice pierced the fog. Can you hear me? He tried to speak, managed a grunt. The extraction was successful, she continued. We got enough marrow. Your children are stabilizing. More voices, police sirens in the distance. They're coming, Mrs. White said somewhere above him. Marcus is with them. Joseph forced his eyes open. The room swam into focus. Lillian sat beside him, clutching a laptop. The files, she said. All the evidence. One press of a button, and every major news outlet gets it. Do it, he rasped. She hesitated. Your reputation never mattered. Speaking hurt, but he pushed through. Save the others. Her fingers moved across the keyboard. Somewhere, servers hummed, spreading truth like wildfire. Time fractured. He drifted between moments. A television showing his company's stock price in freefall. Marcus Chen being led away in handcuffs, shouting about national security. Reporters swarming the monastery gates. Unprecedented corporate scandal. Illegal human trials. CEO's own children among victims. Through it all, 3 heartbeats on the monitors. Growing stronger. Dad? Aiden's voice. The doctors say it worked. Joseph turned his head. His son sat in a wheelchair beside his bed, color returning to his cheeks. Or your sister? Drawing again. Aiden grinned. She won't stop sketching your face. Tears slid down Joseph's temple. Good. More time passed. Days, maybe. His heart struggled, but held. Mrs. White appeared with papers. The board is in chaos. They're calling for an emergency meeting. Let them burn, Joseph whispered. The evidence is overwhelming, Lillian added. 47 children identified so far, all responding to the treatment. The formula, safe. Mrs. White patted her sling. Being distributed to legitimate research facilities as we speak. Joseph nodded, drifting again. But a commotion outside pulled him back. Federal agents, Dr. Rivera reported. With prosecutors. Time to go, Mrs. White decided. They moved quickly, efficiently. Equipment packed, records secured. A helicopter waited on the monastery's roof. Woody. Witness protection, Lillian explained as they helped him onto a stretcher. Until the trials are over. How many arrested? 28 so far. Marcus is talking, trying to save himself. The helicopter blades whirred to life. Barcelona shrank below them, the monastery becoming a toy in the distance. Elia held up her sketchbook. A family portrait, all of them together, whole and healing. For the new house, she said. See wherever it is. Joseph looked at his family, at the city falling away, at the future unfolding before them. His heart beat steady and strong, keeping time with his children's. The news would explode tomorrow. Maxwell Pharmaceuticals would face justice. Lives would be saved. But here, in this moment between sky and earth, none of that mattered. What mattered was Aiden's hand in his, Aaliyah's sketch capturing their truth, Lillian's fingers interlaced with his own. What mattered was love, and that, Joseph realized, was worth any price. White light, endless corridors of white light. He's crashing! Dr. Rivera's voice echoed through the emptiness. Get the crash cart! Joseph floated above himself, watching as medical teams swarmed his body. The witness protection safe house had become an emergency medical ward. Dad, please! Aiden's voice. You promised to see my jump shot! The first shock hit, arcing his body off the bed. Nothing. Again! Dr. Rivera called. Charging to 360. Somewhere, Elia was crying. Lillian was praying. Mrs. White argued with someone about experimental protocols. We have a right to try, she shouted. It's his only chance. Another shock. Flatline. The treatment, Lillian begged. The one you developed, it's untested. Mrs. White warned. Could kill him faster. He's already dying. Joseph wanted to tell them it was okay, that saving the children was enough, but he was floating higher, away from the pain, away from, Papa! Elia's voice cut through the light. I drew our future. You have to see it. Something pulled him back. An anchor of love, of possibility. Administering treatment, Mrs. White's voice. God help us all. Fire replaced the floating. Every cell screaming as the experimental drug coursed through his system. Multiple organ failure, someone reported. He's going into... The second cardiac arrest hit like lightning. Images flashed through his mind. Aiden making that basketball shot. Elia's art hanging in galleries. Lillian's smile in morning light. Grandchildren he'd never meet. Fight! Lillian's command. You don't get to leave us again! The third shock brought pain beyond imagination. His heart stuttered, tried to remember its rhythm. Got a pulse? Dr. Rivera shouted. Weak, but blood pressure rising. Another voice. Cell regeneration at 42%. Joseph clawed his way back through layers of darkness. Every breath hurt. Every heartbeat felt like climbing a mountain. But he climbed. Hours passed, or days. Time lost meaning in the space between heartbeats. The first clear sensation was Aiden's hand in his. Then Elia's tears on his cheek. Lillian's fingers combing through his hair. The treatment worked, Mrs. White said softly. Your body accepted the genetic modification. The heart damage is healing. Joseph forced his eyes open. His family's faces swam into focus. How? His voice was sandpaper. How long? 3 days, Lillian whispered. You died twice. 3 times, Dr. Rivera corrected. A new record. Joseph managed a weak smile. Always overachieving. Elia held up her sketchbook. The future she'd drawn. A family Christmas. All of them gray and wrinkled, surrounded by grandchildren. You promised, she said simply. Still planning? To keep it. Aiden squeezed his hand. The doctors say you'll be stronger than before. The treatment, it fixed everything. Everything. The genetic damage, Mrs. White explained. Your heart. Even the false cancer markers Marcus used. You're healing at an accelerated rate. Joseph looked at his family. These miracles who'd brought him back from death itself. Thank you, he whispered, for not letting go. Lillian kissed his forehead. Never again. Outside, the world was changing. News channels buzzed with updates on the Maxwell Pharmaceuticals scandal. Arrests continued. Lives were being saved. But here, in this room, time stood still. Joseph Maxwell held his family close and felt his renewed heart beating in perfect rhythm with theirs. He had died 3 times to keep his promise, and he'd do it again. For love. 6 months later, a small house on the Portuguese coast. Different names, different lives, same love holding them together. Joseph stood at the water's edge, watching Aiden practice basketball on a court they'd built together. Each shot more confident than the last. His son's genetic damage was completely reversed, his future restored. He's getting good, Lillian said, joining him on the sand. She looked younger somehow, as if shedding their old identities had lifted years of worry from her face. See, better than I was at his age. Joseph pulled her close, his heartbeat strong and steady. a miracle of science and love. "Dad," Aiden called. "Watch this." The ball arced perfectly, swishing through the net. Joseph cheered, remembering his promise in that hospital room. "Where's your sister?" he asked. "Art class." Lillian pointed to the local community center where Elia taught children to draw. "Nay, she's becoming quite the local celebrity." They walked together along the beach. The witness protection program had given them new identity, new beginning, but kept them together. The Silvas, immigrants from Brazil, running a small medical consulting firm. Joseph's phone buzzed, a secure message from Mrs. White. Marcus took the plea deal, 25 years. The foundation treated its 100th child today. The Maxwell Children's Medical Foundation, funded by his seized assets, had become a beacon of hope. Mrs. White ran it under an assumed name, turning corporate crimes into salvation. "Papa!" Elia jogged toward them, sketchbook in hand. "I sold another painting." She showed them the receipt, her third sale this month. The local gallery couldn't get enough of her work. That's wonderful, sweetheart." Joseph hugged her, breathing in the scent of paint and ocean air. "I've been thinking," Lillian said as they walked home, "about writing it all down. The truth, for later, when it's safe. The whole story. People should know. Not just the headlines and court records, but the love that saved us." Joseph watched his children race ahead, so alive, so full of future. Yes, they should. Inside their modest house, photos covered the walls, their new life captured in moments. Aiden's first basketball trophy, Elia's gallery opening, family dinners and beach sunsets. "The U.S. attorney called," Lillian said later that night, after the children were asleep. "They've identified 3 more research sites, more children saved." Joseph nodded, remembering the darkness they'd escaped. "And the company? Dissolved. The legitimate patents transferred to ethical research facilities." He pulled her onto their small balcony, under stars that seemed brighter here than anywhere else. "Any regrets?" he asked. "Just the 13 years we lost." She touched his chest, feeling his heart. "But we have now. We have tomorrow. And the next day," he promised. "And all the days after." Inside, Aiden mumbled in his sleep. Elia's pencil scratched against paper, always drawing, even in darkness. Joseph Maxwell had died 3 times to save his children, had lost a fortune to find his soul, had traveled through darkness to reach this light. Looking at his family, at their small house full of love, he knew it had been worth every heartbeat. The past was ashes, the future was paint on canvas, basketball on ocean breezes, love stronger than death itself. And here, on a Portuguese beach with his children's laughter echoing in the salt air, Joseph finally understood. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find what was yours all along. He held Lillian close, their hearts beating in sync, and smiled. This wasn't an ending. It was a recomeço, a beginning, and it was beautiful.